Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhaso, and this morning we'll be going through another discourse of the Buddha from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, sutta number 48. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the discourse and give some explanations. And then if there's any questions, I'll answer those at the end, so you can type in questions at any time during the broadcast, and I'll respond to them after the sutta. So we can start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So this one is, as mentioned in Anguttara Nikaya 5.48, which is the Alabbhanīya Sutta, which Alabbhanīya means unobtainable, something that can't be obtained. And Thana just means a situation or circumstance. So Alabbhanīya Thana means circumstances which are unobtainable, things which we can't actually get. Something that's impossible to experience. So the Buddha begins, he says, mendicants, that's bhikkhus. Mendicants, there are 5 things that cannot be had by any contemplative or Brahmin, or Deva, or Mara, or Brahma, or by anyone in the world. What 5? So in the first one, he says that someone liable to aging should not age. He says, so this first one, so in Pali it's Jara Dhammang Majiriti. So Jara Dhamma means of the nature to decay. So the word jara, it's often translated simply as aging or as old age. But the word jara, as it's used throughout the suttas, has more specifically the meaning of something wearing out in old age. So it's more the sense of decay or decrepitude brought on by the aging process. So jara doesn't just mean aging or old age, it means specifically the decrepitude and decay that accompanies aging, that accompanies old age. So that's important to understand because for some people, old age has a positive connotation. When they hear old age, they think of these like cute, wise, kind, peaceful, elderly people, like the wise old grandmother or the wise old sage or something. That's not what the Buddha is talking about. When he uses the word jara, it doesn't have that positive sense. The word jara has an exclusively negative sense of meaning the loss of one's physical and mental faculties as the body and mind decays in old age. So it's good to clarify exactly what we're talking about here. So I prefer to translate jara as decrepitude or as decay. Rather than as old age, because old age doesn't quite capture the intended meaning here. So that's someone liable to decay, decrepitude, failing of one's faculties during the aging process. So wishing that someone subject to decrepitude not become decrepit, not decay. And the Buddha says this is unobtainable. So no one can stop the aging process. Nobody can stop the inevitable decline of the physical and mental faculties. And the Buddha says it doesn't matter whether they're a samana, so a samana is a contemplative, a spiritual practitioner, or a brahmana, so a priest, a religious person, a ceremonialist, or a deva. So even the angels and celestial beings and demigods, not even they can stop the decrepitude process, the decay process. Or Mara. So even Mara is the most powerful of the devas, also the most abjectly evil of the devas. Also, Mara can't stop the aging process. Not even Brahma. So Brahma being the next category of celestial beings above the ordinary devas. Which in Hindu cosmology were normally considered to be the highest, most powerful beings in the universe. So not even they can stop the inevitable decline due to old age. And this is important because it's very common to fall into a sense of denial or unwillingness to accept or resistance when faced with the aging-related decline, either of ourselves or of our loved ones. If you have an elderly relative who's experiencing loss of their physical and mental faculties in old age, it's very common that people will, initially, they'll reject the situation. They just won't believe it. It's like, well, my mother and father, my grandparents, they've always been healthy, they've always been intellectually sharp, they've always been more or less emotionally stable. Why would I expect it to be otherwise? They've been this way for my entire life. And it's like, well, but the truth is that when they get into their 70s and 80s and 90s, then all of that falls away. Physical health fails, mental health fails, emotional stability often also fails. And that's just the reality of things. But it's often quite difficult for us to accept that reality because we're so accustomed to a different kind of experience, a different kind of reality. So one of the things the Buddha is really encouraging us to do is to fully accept the reality of things, the reality of decrepitude, the inevitability of the decline and failure of body and mind. And so, of course, this also applies to ourselves. So just as I've known many people who really struggled to accept the decrepitude of their elderly relatives, I've also met elderly people who couldn't accept their own decrepitude. People moving into their 80s and starting to lose their physical health they'd already been losing for decades at that point, but starting to lose their mental health and just not willing to accept the reality of the situation. Still deeply attached to a self-image of being somebody young and healthy, unwilling to accept the circumstance of being elderly and decrepit. But the people I've met who actually were old and decrepit, but who were completely accepting of that reality. It's not that their mind was any sharper or clearer, but their full acceptance of the situation meant that they were enduring the situation with gracefulness, with serenity. Actually, one of the most joyful people I've met is a very senile 90-year-old lady who she's always just like hanging out on the couch with a big smile on her face. She has no idea what's going on around her. She has no idea what other people are talking about. She has a very hard time understanding anything. But she doesn't mind. She's fully accepted that that's her situation and that it's totally natural and there isn't actually anything wrong. So she's really delightful. She's just sitting there radiating serenity and joy, and she clearly has developed an open heart. You can feel her metta just being in her presence. And she's not fighting the reality of decrepitude. She's accepted it completely. And then, again, other people who they're trying to fight tooth and nail every step of the way, but the truth is it's inevitable. Decrepitude is something which comes to all of us in one form or another. And actually it starts very early in life. So the decline of one's physical faculties actually starts in your 30s. So peak health is in your 20s, and when you get into your 30s, your body starts gradually declining. And the older you get, the faster the decline happens. So, and then the second one is wishing that someone liable to sickness not get sick. So this also is something that the Buddha said is unobtainable. Nobody can prevent the body from getting sick. So the nature of the body is that it's subject to sickness, it's subject to illness. So of course we try to take care of our health. Elsewhere in the suttas, it's quite clear that the Buddha did actually recommend taking care of your health. But you might take care of your health extremely well and still get sick, because that's the nature of bodies. The nature of bodies is that they're prone to sickness. They're a nest of disease. So we, of course, we do our best to take care of our body, but we also accept that no matter how hard we try to take care of our body, it's still the nature of the body that it's going to malfunction, it's going to contract diseases of various sorts, it's going to fail to function the way we expect it to. And that's the nature of bodies. So fully embracing that reality means that then when we experience sickness, it doesn't bother us. We recognize, oh, this is just the nature of the body. The nature of the body is to be ill. And of course this applies both to others and to ourselves. So also when our loved ones or our friends and family members are sick, then we acknowledge, yeah, this is normal. This isn't some catastrophic, unnatural disaster. It's actually a perfectly normal, natural circumstance to have relatives and friends that are sick, just as it is with ourselves. So also with ourselves. It's unrealistic to expect ourselves to be perfectly healthy for our entire life. It's actually realistic to expect our body to be sick from time to time. So when we're feeling sick, when we're having problems with our health, well, we just acknowledge this is the reality of things. This is just how bodies work. And it's unrealistic to expect anything otherwise. So cultivating acceptance and serenity of that fact. The third one, so wishing that someone liable to death should not die. So again, you can't stop death. Says there's an old saying, there's only two things that are inevitable, death and taxes. And that's actually not true, because you can evade taxes. So death, on the other hand, is in fact completely unavoidable. There's nothing we can do to stop death. We can try to delay it a little while, try to live a few more years maybe if you're really careful, but you cannot stop death. It comes inevitably. And even if you do everything you can to prolong your life, you might still die in an accident or contract a fatal disease. Or every now and then people just suddenly die for no explainable reason. I had a friend who used to come to the monastery regularly. And then, so healthy young man in his 30s. And one day he was just walking through the grocery store and just suddenly collapsed on the floor dead. No medical explanation. There was nothing apparently wrong with him. He just, suddenly his heart stopped beating and he fell to the ground dead. These things happen sometimes. So it's just the nature of life, that life comes inevitably with death. So we can't stop it in others and we can't stop it in ourselves. So also coming to full terms with this fact, full terms with the reality that every one of us is going to die. Actually, people sometimes ask for mantras. One of my favorite mantras is, we're all going to die. So every now and then I'll just repeat this to myself in my mind a few times. We're all going to die. We're all going to die. We're all going to die. And it really, really gives a sense of perspective. It's like, oh, so why are we getting all caught up in silly things when we're all going to die? Why are we giving importance to things that are not important? Why are we wasting our time on frivolous things? We're all going to die. So that's one value of it, is that it helps us to prioritize correctly. But also, it's just coming to grips with the reality of things. Nobody lives forever. Everybody dies. Every single person we know is going to die. Every single friend, every single relative, every single one of them is going to die. Earlier today, the monastery cat was sitting on my lap, and I was looking at him and imagining him dead in my lap, like this was his dead body. Rather than living cat in my lap, this was a dead cat in my lap. And so this is coming to grips with the reality that he is in fact going to die at some point. And the same is true of everybody else in our life. And the same is true for ourselves. So recognizing that death is inevitable, and there's nothing we can do to avoid it or stop it. And then the mind comes to peace with the reality of death, and it no longer bothers us. Then the next two, so this is interesting because up to this point it's been the standard 5 recollections, but here it diverges slightly. The first 3 are the same as the 5 recollections, but then the 4th and 5th ones are in Pali, Kaya Dhamma and Nasana Dhamma. So Kaya means elimination or destruction, and Nasana means loss. So Kaya Dhamma Ma Kiya, so wishing that that which is subject to elimination or exhaustion or being worn away or removed is not eliminated, not exhausted, not used up or worn out. So this is a broader contemplation. It's recognizing that all things are subject to removal, to elimination. All things are subject to being used up. So there's no such thing as an unlimited resource. There's no such thing as a perfectly renewable resource. Everything gets used up and worn out sooner or later. So this is the reality of entropy, the reality of the inevitable wearing out and loss of all things. So this can be useful in terms of one's relationship to possessions, for example. Whatever you have that you like, well, reflect that it's going to wear out. It's not going to last forever. Maybe it's an article of clothing. Well, it's going to wear out. Eventually it's going to fade and become tattered and frayed. That's its nature. And someday you're going to have to get rid of it because it will be completely useless. Furniture breaks, warps, declines. That's its nature. So this is a useful reflection for all the resources that we have in our life. They're all subject to wearing out, to being used up. And the 5th one, Nasana Dhamma. So Nasana means losing. So this is the reflection on loss. We're going to lose everything. So I've known some people who were always absolutely terrified of the thought that they might lose things. And it was always a complete disaster for them whenever they actually did lose something. Well, come to grips with the fact you're going to lose literally everything. Every single thing you have, you can pick it up and tell yourself, I'm going to lose this. And just come to full terms with that fact. And then when you actually do lose it, then it won't bother you. You'll have already accustomed the mind to that reality. The reality that everything is going to be lost. Everything is subject to being lost. And so the Buddha goes on. He says, so the uneducated commoner, the asuttava patujana in Pali. So asuttava means one who has not heard. And in particular in the suttas, this means one who has not heard the Dhamma. One who has not learned the Dhamma. So asuttava, one who has not heard the Dhamma, one who has not learned the Dhamma. And patujana, putu means common, ordinary, widespread. And jana means populace, generation. So patujana means the ordinary people, common people. And in the suttas, patujana then is used to mean all the ordinary people of the world, all the people who are living ordinary, normal, conventional lives. In particular, people who are not living a dedicated spiritual life. And the word patujana further usually has the added sense of somebody who has not attained any stage of awakening. So the asuttava patujana then is talking about the ordinary person living a mundane, non-spiritual life, who has not learned the Dhamma and probably doesn't have any interest in learning the Dhamma. And even if they did learn some Dhamma, they wouldn't be practicing it anyway. So this is 99% of the people in the world. They're not spiritual practitioners, not interested in learning Dhamma, they're not interested in training the heart. They're just interested in doing ordinary mundane things, making money, pursuing sensual gratification, doing ordinary worldly things like having children and going to school and all that kind of ordinary worldly person kind of stuff. So the Buddha says, the asuttava patujana, the uneducated commoner, is subject to decrepitude, and they decay. So they're subject to decay and they decay. But they don't reflect on decay. So they don't reflect, the Buddha says. It's not just me who is subject to decay and who decays. For as long as sentient beings come and go, pass away and are reborn, they all are subject to decay and they all decay. So this is the contemplation that the Buddha is encouraging us, is to recognize that these 5 realities that he mentioned, so decrepitude, sickness, death, wearing out, and loss, these 5 things are universal. Every single sentient being that has ever existed and ever will exist, all of them have gone through these exact same 5 experiences in some form or another. It's a universal experience. And the contemplation continues. One is to reflect. If I were to sorrow and wail and lament, beating my breast and falling into despair, just because of being liable to decay and decaying, then I would lose my appetite and my physical appearance would deteriorate, my work wouldn't get done, my enemies would be encouraged, and my friends would be dispirited. So this reflection then is reflecting on the uselessness of despairing about the unpleasant truths of reality. So when we fall into despair and depression about the state of reality, well, that just makes things even worse. We start thinking, oh no, I'm getting old, this is awful. Oh no, I'm going to die, this is awful. Oh no, I'm going to lose everything, this is awful. Well, then we just make things even more awful, because now we're adding on a big pile of depression and despair on top of everything else. So our own life gets worse. And also our friends get worried about us. It just starts to spread this sense of doom and gloom, both for ourselves and for our circle of friends and acquaintances. And we also wind up not doing what needs to be done on top of everything else. So again, our life declines even farther. So the Buddha says the uneducated commoner, they don't reflect in this way. They don't reflect on the universal and inevitable aspect of these 5 experiences. They also don't reflect on the uselessness of falling into depression and lamentation about that which is normal and natural. And the Buddha says, and so when being liable to decay, they decay, then they sorrow and wail and lament, beating their breast and falling into confusion. And the Buddha says, this is called an uneducated commoner struck by sorrow's poisoned arrow, who only torments themselves. So again, he's pointing to the fact that when one doesn't relate properly to the reality of decay, sickness, death, and loss, then one is just tormenting oneself. One is just unnecessarily torturing oneself. And so the Buddha applies this same statement to each of the five, and again pointing out that the uneducated commoner doesn't reflect properly upon the inevitable reality of these five things, and therefore torments themselves. But on the other hand, the Buddha says the educated disciple of the noble ones, so that's Suttava Arya Savaka. So Suttava means one who has heard the Dhamma, one who has learned the Dhamma. And Arya Savaka, this term, so Arya means noble, and Savaka literally means listener, but we usually translate it as disciple. And the term Arya Savaka can be translated in two main ways. So one is disciple of the noble ones, so a Savaka of the Arya. And the other is a disciple who is noble, so Savaka, who is Arya. And in the suttas, an Arya Savaka is inevitably spoken about as a person who is not yet awakened, not yet fully awakened, but who is still in a process of training the mind. So I tend to take Arya Savaka as disciple of the noble ones, one who is learning the Dhamma and discipline of those who are awakened. So educated disciple of the noble ones, subject to death, subject to decay, sickness, death, wearing out, and loss. Then they reflect on it properly. So as the Buddha says, they reflect, it is not just me who is liable to decay, sickness, death, wearing out, and loss. But for as long as sentient beings come and go, pass away, and are reborn, they all are subject to these things. And one reflects, if I were to sorrow and wail and lament, beating my breast and falling into confusion just because of these five things, then I would lose my appetite, my physical appearance would deteriorate, my work wouldn't get done, my enemies would be encouraged, and my friends would be dispirited. And the Buddha continues, he says, and so when subject to these five things, they do not sorrow and wail and lament, beating their breast and falling into confusion. And this is called a learned disciple of the noble ones who has drawn out sorrow's poisoned arrow, struck by which uneducated commoners torment themselves. And the Buddha continues, he says, sorrowless, free of thorns, the disciple of the noble one only extinguishes themselves. So extinguishes here is a bit of an awkward translation of parinibba which means to attain full awakening, to extinguish one's greed, hatred, and delusion. So the translation here, extinguish themselves, needs to be understood. It's referring to extinguishing one's defilements and delusions, putting out the fire of the mind, putting out the fire that's tormenting the mind. So the Buddha applies this contemplation to all of the five things. And then there's a brief poem that concludes the sutta. So as we commonly see, especially in the Anguttara Nikaya, there's often a short poem at the end of the suttas. So the poem goes, sorrowing and lamenting doesn't do even a little bit of good. When they know that you're sad, your enemies are encouraged. When a wise person does not waver in the face of adversity, as they're able to evaluate what's beneficial, their enemies suffer, seeing that their expression does not change. Chants, recitations, fine sayings, charity, or tradition, if by means of any such things you benefit, then by all means keep doing them. But if you understand that this good thing cannot be had by me or by anyone else, you should accept it without sorrowing, thinking, this karma is powerful, what can I do now? So this is just a brief poem reiterating the point of the discourse, reiterating that to despair and wail and weep about the reality of, the unpleasant reality of things doesn't do any good. It just adds more suffering. But instead, if our spiritual practices can help us to cultivate some serenity in the face of the difficulties of life, then we should keep doing that. And again, that we should reflect on the inevitability of these 5 realities. So that's the end of the discourse. We can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions to answer. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And welcome to the people checking in online. Welcome to Jay, John, Jayanta, Nico, Rebecca, Mike, Daus, Sunya, Karuna, and Amaranta, as well as everybody else who's watching. Welcome. And I see a couple things here. So Daus says, healthy lifestyle improves the odds of body not falling apart. Actually, that's incorrect. Healthy lifestyle just delays the body falling apart. The body will inevitably fall apart. That's its nature. You cannot stop it. That's part of the point of the sutta. You cannot stop decay. You can possibly delay it a little bit if you take good care of your body, but even that's not a guarantee. So I've known people who lived an extremely healthy life and took extremely good care of their body and still died young. Still experienced a massive decline of physical and mental health because of things outside of their control. So yes, of course, it's good to take care of your health. Again, there's actually quite a number of things in the suttas which, and in the Vinaya, which indicate that we can take care of our health. We're not supposed to ignore our bodies. But we should reflect on the inevitability of sickness and decay, so that we're not troubled when such things happen to us. And Nico says, decrepitude as process seems the most challenging part. Are contemplations of the body and recollections of death in the Satipatthana for this? To understand process of decay, help to engage death? So, as mentioned earlier, it is important to accept the reality of things, so that one is not, cultivating delusion. So I've also met a few people who have this delusion that they're never going to get old, and they're never going to experience decrepitude, and they're never going to lose what they love. And it's like, well, may it be so, friend, but not going to happen. And then inevitably when bad things happen, then they're caught completely off guard and have a really hard time accepting it. So Buddhism is ultimately about coming to terms with reality, coming face to face with reality, and cultivating a serene, wise, joyful acceptance of reality. So that's the main reason why we do these sorts of contemplations. It's because when we come to a full, peaceful acceptance of the reality of decay, sickness, death, and loss, then such things no longer have the ability to bother us. They cannot break our happiness. They cannot break our serenity. Nico says, did you say mental decline begins in the 30s in addition to physical? Well, just speaking of my own experience, my memory has definitely dropped dramatically since my 20s. So I've heard other people say similar things, that they've also noticed a decline, both physical and mental, as they progress through their 30s and into their 40s. So it's relatively slight, but yeah, it does seem to be the situation. And it just goes downhill from there, just gets worse. And somebody named Hello says, I have developed a profound aversion towards walking meditation. It's not quite on the topic of the sutta. So maybe, hello, maybe you could bring this question to Monk Chat Friday evening. That's for questions on any topic. So Mike says, in order to reflect on these properly is the key to not take these things personally and instead focus on the recognition that they're universal truths. It seems quite easy to fall into depression. Could you recommend a way to correct ourselves if we find ourselves taking these things personally? So that is part of the emphasis of this particular sutta. The sutta is emphasizing the fact that these are universal experiences. So it's not personal, as you're saying, but it's something that literally every single sentient being goes through. Decay, sickness, death, and loss. Literally everybody goes through these things, without exception. So yeah, it's not personal. It's just the way reality works. So that's more the point. It's recognizing that this is just the way things work, and it isn't an obstacle to awakening. It's not something that, again, is targeting us personally, and it's not something that prevents us from becoming fully awakened. And Amaranta says, living with illness that advances as I get older makes me feel unhappy when crisis appears. Do you have some advice to accept this more peaceful? Well, one thing that can be useful is to cultivate a peaceful, joyful mind during meditation practice, and then return to that. Remind yourself of that. Remind yourself that when you do actually cultivate Dhamma practice, that the mind can come to a place of peacefulness and serene joy. Regardless of your sickness, regardless of the difficult circumstances in your life, when we train the mind, when we cultivate the heart, then we can experience peace and joy. Again, illness is normal. Decline of faculties is normal. Dying is normal. Nothing there is actually wrong. That's just nature expressing itself. If anything, it's a good reminder of the importance of cultivating our spiritual practice, because that's the only true safety. The only true safety is in training the mind to be fully at peace with the reality of decay, sickness, death, and loss. So when we train the mind to be at peace with these things, then they no longer have any power over us. They no longer have the ability to disturb us. They no longer have the ability to disturb our happiness. And Rebecca says, doesn't cultivating right view help with mental health even as we decline? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So there's a distinction between right view and mental health. You can have right view, but still fall into senile dementia in your old age. Because that's a physical health issue. So it's a physical health issue expressing itself mentally. So if you're experiencing, for example, brain damage, you may have really good right view, but if your brain is damaged, then from the outside, it's going to seem like you're not behaving correctly. You're not thinking clearly. But on the inside, you might be perfectly fine. So cultivating right view doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to stop the advance of dementia. Doesn't necessarily mean that you can keep your body and mind in perfect health necessarily. What it means is that you'll always recognize clearly what's happening to you, and you won't be knocked off balance by it. It won't disturb you or upset you. And that's the last question. So if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. we'll see you next time.